going to start talking a little bit now about holy objects, about some of these things that we find in the Bible that are sacred stuff of the priests. These pieces are, you'll know these things like the Ark of the Covenant, but oftentimes we know about them very vaguely, so I think it helps us to ask questions about what these are in particular. Most of our knowledge, our cultural knowledge, the reservoir of our cultural knowledge about the Ark of the Covenant comes from Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is not a great source of historical information or biblical knowledge. However, fine film. But this is what most people have in mind when they think about the Ark of the Covenant. Let me read you one of the oldest descriptions of the Ark, and that is from Exodus 25, from our reading for today. So Exodus 25 tells us about the Ark of the Covenant. Right after God says, make me a sanctuary, then God talks about this Ark. So God says, verse 10 and on, they shall make me an ark of acacia wood, and it's going to be 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. A cubit's about 3 feet. You're going to put gold all over it and so on. There's going to be rings for poles to be able to move this thing. There's going to be a seat, verse 17. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. This word mercy seat, a cover, a kippur. This is the same thing for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It's this kind of a seat of mercy or seat of atonement. So there's a seat involved. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold. A cherubim is a very specific thing in the ancient world. It is a lion-bodied, human-headed, winged object. It's an animal-human hybrid with wings. It was another word for this is sphinx, the Egyptian word for it. They didn't have wings as much in Egyptian art, but in the art of the Levant, this is a very common object. So it's not particular to the Israelite people. It's a very common. It's understood to be a kind of sacred guardian, a divine being that is below the high gods. They don't use the word for them here, but angel might be a word to use it. When people think about cherubim today, they often think about tiny little babies, like chubby babies with wings, like Michelangelo. That image comes from actually Roman culture and Roman art. Those are the putti, these little Roman baby angels, but they're not in the Bible. Cherubim are fierce animal creatures with human heads, and they are divine. They are not human, right? So these are images of the cherubim, and there's 2 of them. And the verse 20, the cherubim shall spread their wings out above, overshadowing the mercy seat with their wings, and they shall face one another. So the faces of them are supposed to be kind of turned toward each other. And then you shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and there I will meet with you from above the mercy seat. That's verse 22. There I will meet with you from between the 2 cherubim that are on the Ark of the Covenant, and I will deliver to you all my commands for the Israelites. So God's presence is associated with this thing, and God sits there and gives orders or commands. Now, where would a king, what kind of seat would you have for someone who's issuing commands to a people? That's a throne, right? We can see this. This phrase kind of shows up other places in 1 Samuel 4, verses 4 through 7. The Ark of the Covenant is taken, but in verse 4, it says, "As the Ark of the Yahweh of hosts, who is enthroned upon the cherubim." This you can find this in the Psalms as well. The idea of being enthroned upon the cherubim. The cherubim are creating a throne, so it's not like this. It's more like this. This right here is actually a carving. It's a drawing of a carving from the ancient world. This is from ancient Megiddo, which was a Canaanite city that became an Israelite city. This is from the Canaanite part. So this is a Canaanite king right here. And guess what the Canaanite king is sitting on right there? That's a cherub throne. See how it's got one wing that overshadows and then one wing that is kind of pointing towards the other cherubim, right? And so the other one is like this, the other way. Yeah. So their wings are meeting and creating a place to sit. And this is, by the way, a little footstool. You've heard about footstools and so on. You want to have the king sit up high, but then you don't want the king's feet dangling off looking like a little child. So they make these places to rest the feet. Here is a Phoenician king who is depicted upon a cherub throne. Look that's a cherubim. That's a human-headed, lion-bodied, winged creature that is forming a throne with wings. This comes from right around the time that the Bible was written. This is an Iron Age Phoenician king's image. This is a seal from Syria, ancient Syria, and you can see that there's a lion that is forming a throne for a goddess. This is the Phoenician throne. This comes from Sidon, a Phoenician city, and this is the throne for Astarte, one of the Phoenician goddesses, and it actually says Astarte is invisibly enthroned upon this seat. So the idea was that the gods or goddesses would be enthroned upon these things, but you couldn't see them because they were taking an invisible form. So this is a common thing. It's a throne, right? It's a place for the king to sit, or the god to sit. And so this is actually a pretty decent depiction of what the Ark of the Covenant would have looked like according to the description in Exodus 25. It's got the poles, so you can carry it so you don't touch it, because it's a very, very, very holy object, and if you risk becoming ritually impure somehow, you don't even know how, and you touch this thing, and then you would die. This occurs in the Bible several times. So Uzzah, a guy who accidentally touches the Ark of the Covenant in the book of Samuel, he dies. It's not because God hates him. God's upset about it, but God's upset that this happened. It's kind of like a nuclear incident. Someone doesn't necessarily sinful for like forgetting to flip a switch or for doing something impulsively. That they're not trying to make a nuclear incident, but it might happen. So that's kind of like what the Uzzah story is showing us. Or the Nadab and Abihu, they were reckless on the altar, and so let some of this explosion out. So that's why you got to be careful with the Ark of the Covenant, because it's God's presence, the site of divine presence. But also it's mobile. It's a mobile throne, right? A mobile throne so that God can be present with the people in a very visible form as they move around. And then when you stop camp, that's when you set up a tent, according to Exodus. We'll get to the tent in just a moment. But just to show you that these ideas and objects change throughout time, or at least conceptions of them change throughout time. Different biblical texts have different ideas about what the Ark of the Covenant looks like and what it is. If you turn to Deuteronomy chapter 10, you get a different depiction of what the Ark of the Covenant looked like and what it is. Chapter 10 in Deuteronomy, God says to Moses, carve out 2 tablets of stone and so on. And then verse 3, I make an ark out of acacia wood. An ark really means a chest, like a thing you can store stuff in. That's why this looks like a mobile chest, right? So I made an ark of acacia wood, cut 2 tablets of stone, and went up the mountain with the 2 tablets in my hand. So in that verse, you can see that the ark is the thing used to carry, it's the box used to carry the 2 tablets. And it can be carried by Moses alone with one hand. And it's just made of wood. This goes along with Deuteronomy's bigger ideas about who God is and what we're supposed to do with sacred objects and so on. So the priests in the P source have a different idea about what the Ark of the Covenant looks like than Deuteronomy does. And guess what? The priests like the flashy gold objects. They like the big ideas about God's presence, and God is on this thing and moving with them and so on. Very liturgical. So you can see that there was a kind of an argument, a long-term argument in ancient Israel about what these objects are and what they meant. I think both the priestly and Deuteronomistic versions of the Ark of the Covenant are rich theologically. They come out of a larger symbolic world that doesn't always agree with each other. So we're in the priestly symbolic world, so we'll stay here for a minute now. But another major object was that of the temple. So here we see a ziggurat from Mesopotamia. This today is kind of near Baghdad. But this is it's in what the modern state of Iraq. But you can see that this is a ziggurat that has been reconstructed so that it shows you what it was supposed to look like back then. So a ziggurat was not a temple, right? It was the place where the gods would go up and down. And notice that it's a giant stairway. It's also kind of like a mountain. This is a stairway to heaven, right? There would have been another layer on top of this that has never been reconstructed, but just so you can see these ancient, massive monumental spaces where the gods were understood to go up and come down from heaven. It's supposed to look like a mountain. The mountains were places of God's presence in the ancient world. This can be related to the ladder in Jacob's ladder, right? In that story where Jacob is at Bethel, goes to sleep, and then wakes up and sees the angels ascending and descending on a ladder up to heaven. And then he says, hey, this is a really important spot. And then he founds the temple at Bethel there, right? Builds an altar, and later there's a temple at Bethel. It becomes very important for the northern kingdom of Israel. All to say that this is, he saw this ascending and descending and knew that it was supposed to be a place of God's presence, and so built a temple there. So the temple is a place where God can kind of inhabit a holy space, a space set aside for the gods. And it's associated with these mountains and climbing and making ladders and things. Here you can see this mountain-shaped, kind of also step-shaped pyramid. The pyramids were also understood to kind of participate in this kind of ancient symbolic architecture that was supposed to show you something about the cosmos and the gods and so on, and how everything worked. This is the step pyramid, and you can see, by the way, the step pyramid at Saqqara in Egypt, and you can see that there's a kind of a temple here, and check this out. So this space here, this is like a mountain coming out here, and there was this sacred space here, which was like a sacred space where people could organize and have meals and events and so on. But it was supposed to look like the water. This is because ancient stories in Egypt about the creation of the world sometimes had the idea that the waters of the major flood receded, or the creation waters receded, and there was a sacred hill that emerged. And the idea was that sacred mountain was like present symbolically in every single Egyptian sacred space. Every temple, even if it was on a flat place in the delta, in the Nile in Egypt, like very, very flat place. Think about like the New Orleans Delta or something. If you built a big temple there, you would say, hey, this is the tallest mountain in the world, because it was symbolically participating in that space. And sometimes they would even have like a piece of dirt, a little bit of dirt at the altar, and they would say that was dirt from this original sacred mountain or something. So there was this symbolic presence of God in these spaces, or the gods in these spaces, but also this kind of cosmic geography that had to do with creation itself that was associated with these spaces. This is the oldest map of the world that we know of. This is an ancient Babylonian map of the world. Here's the world, and Babylon is of course at the center, and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are depicted as these lines and so on, these Tigris and Euphrates. And here's basically Mesopotamia, little cities kind of all scattered around, and then here's the kind of the outer ocean, the Persian Gulf, and what was understood to kind of circle around the whole world. And then these mountains at the very edges, these kind of sacred mountains that held up the outside of the earth. So we can see from the cosmic geography here, these mountains at the edges of the world that held up the dome, the bowl, right, of heaven. Lots of ancient people kind of saw the world this way, but also they understood that like these mountains at the edges of the world were spaces where you could come into contact with God or the gods. This was like super sacred spaces. So those mountains at the edges were also kind of mirrored in some of these mountains near the center of the earth, where if you put a temple kind of near them or on them, then they participated in this reality of being close to the gods, in a liminal space with the gods at the edges of the world. So a lot of this symbolic participation is found in ancient ritual architecture, which is important for us because Zion, the mountain, the sacred mountain of Jerusalem, is understood to be this massive thing. How beautiful is Zion? How huge is Zion? I don't know if you've ever been to Jerusalem or seen pictures, but Zion is little, and it's overshadowed by the Mount of Olives, which is next to it. It's not even the biggest mountain right there in Jerusalem, but it was symbolically the biggest of all mountains, and so on. So this kind of symbolic geography is really important to the ancient priests. This is an ancient Mesopotamian and a Neo-Assyrian, so contemporaneous with biblical Israel. This is a wall relief, a carving in a wall for a king, and you can see here a temple, and there's a god up here, and then you can see this is a mountain, a sacred mountain with rivers flowing through it, and then an altar here. So this kind of sacred space was understood to be almost like Eden. There's plants growing everywhere, and it's got beautiful trees and stuff. You ever read the Psalms, and they're talking about trees in the temple of God, or palm trees and so on? There were trees planted in the temple, likely. in order to symbolize its participation in this kind of cosmic garden, the garden of the gods. And these rivers flowing through it and so on. It's kind of symbolically in in Genesis 2, the discussion of the rivers that are flowing through the garden. There you see it right here. And this altar here for sacrifice. This is what a temple is. At least it's how it's understood in the ancient world, a place for the gods to live. So the word for temple in ancient Hebrew is the same as the word for palace. It was just a big palace, a big house for God, just a place for God to hang out. You can see this reflected in Exodus in what they call the tabernacle. The Hebrew word for that is mishkan. It means a place to dwell, like a mobile dwelling place. So you can see this in Exodus 33 is an example of kind of this thing on the move. The Lord said to Moses, and in Exodus 33 they're told to kind of leave Sinai, but really in Numbers 10 they really leave Sinai. So the tent is described in verse 7. So this tent, the tabernacle itself is composed of a tent, a giant tent. Now Moses used to take this tent and pitch it outside the camp. It makes it sound like this is a small thing that Moses can move himself. He can't. He needs whole teams of people to move this thing. We'll read about those different teams of people who have to move this giant mobile tent in the wilderness in the book of Numbers. These are connected to the people who actually served the temple once we get to Jerusalem. So the mobile tent, the tabernacle, is like a picture of what the temple is going to be like later. It's a temporary mobile temple. So all of the ideas about the tabernacle are just pictures of what the temple is going to be like, according to the narrative. So now verse 7 of Exodus 33. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off in the camp. It's holy, it's got to be separate. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which is outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, everyone would stand and rise at the entrance of their tent. They would, this kind of ritual that happens, right? It's a liturgy, a pilgrimage in a way. Verse 9, when Moses entered the tent, the pillar of the cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. So this is where Moses would go to hang out with God and ask questions and so on. So the people would rise and bow down and so on when they saw this, and then God would speak to Moses face to face like a friend and so on. And Joshua, the son of Nun, would stand out the front and kind of guard it in a way. Okay, so you see this is like a basic idea that God is going to meet with God isn't always there, right? God shows up at certain times and places to be able to have this conversation with Moses. We can actually see, and the ark would be in this thing, by the way. The tabernacle would be a place where you could park the ark, and then you set this up, and it's like God's. If you think about God like a king, Yahweh is king, right? According to the Bible, Exodus 15, Yahweh's treated like the king of Israel, and this is true of ancient gods as well. Yahweh gets a palace like a king. That's the temple. It's like just a house, the God's house. In the same way, you can think about when a king travels. When a king goes on a journey, the retinue comes with the king, right? All the folks come to help the king out. But also you would have the king travel in like a very nice kind of paneled house, a little mobile room, right? So that the king doesn't get too sweaty or whatever, But this is kind of like the ark, they're taking the king along on the journey, and then when you stop, you set up this very nice tent for the king with luxurious food and whatever. If you think about ancient movies about the ancient world or something and an ancient king, you see these kind of lavish tents set up and so on. And that's the idea about the tabernacle. But also, turn with me to Numbers chapter 9. There's a little bit of a different depiction about this tent here. So in Numbers chapter 9, starting with verse 15, it says, on the day the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the covenant. And from the evening, so the Ark of the Covenant is in there, right? And from the evening until morning, it was over the tabernacle, having the appearance of fire. So the cloud's always there, according to Numbers chapter 9, verse 15, right? It was always so. The cloud covered it by day and so on. When the cloud lifted, the Israelites would set out, and when the Lord would stop, the cloud would come down, and then everyone would stop. As long as that cloud rested over the tabernacle, it would remain in camp. That's in verse 18. So then sometimes the cloud would stay there for a bunch of days and so on, and then Verse 23, at the command of the Lord they would camp, and at the command of the Lord they would set out. So that God's presence is always among them in Numbers chapter 9, verses 15 through 23, whereas God seems to kind of show up now and again in Exodus 33. According to biblical scholars, Exodus 33 is probably not a P-text, one of the few non-P texts in Exodus. Numbers chapter 9, that is a P-text. So this is the priestly source telling you that Yahweh is always in the temple. Yahweh doesn't come and go from the temple as Yahweh pleases, right? So there's a debate in ancient Israel about where is Yahweh? Where is Yahweh to be found? What is the temple? How does it work? So the temple in Jerusalem, according to the priestly source, was a bit like the entire universe, in like the whole cosmos in miniature. So these two big pillars, according to 1 Kings 8 and 7 and 8, which talks about the creation of the temple by Solomon. This is Yachin and Boaz, which means by strength he founded. It's about God founding the universe. This is the sea, this basin right here. This is the sea. It's the cosmic ocean. So all the different parts of the temple are in a way a bit like the whole cosmos, which the whole entire universe then is understood to be kind of a temple, right? God dwells in the universe. And the temple is the tiny picture of the earth, but it's also a tiny picture of the entire universe in which God dwells. So there would have been like this courtyard space where people could gather for major sacrificial feasts and so on. But going inside the temple meant you had to be a priest, and then going inside the Holy of Holies was even even more reserved, right? Only one person could go in the Holy of Holies on one day a year. That's the high priest, and the priest would have to wear like bells on his vestments, his ritual clothing, so that if he died and the bell stopped ringing because he was in God's presence, then you'd have to kind of pull him out with a rope because no one else wanted to die going in there to get him. So in other words, it was understood to be dangerous. Smoke would be all in the Holy of Holies because that would kind of shield you from seeing God and being too exposed to God's holiness and so on. But also inside God's temple, there was all this stuff, holy objects, like the Ark of the Covenant, but also this other big throne with two cherubim. So that you take the ark out and kind of move it around. That was the mobile presence of God. But the temple was kind of the house in which you'd park the car, right? Being the Ark of the Covenant. And there was a big, nicer, a huge throne there. But then also you would have like at the table. You need a table to host people. The showbread, there would be bread there. So if someone walks in, you could be hospitable. That's the idea. The menorah was the lampstand. You need light in a house. So the different implements of the actual palace or the divine house, that's the stuff that's in the temple that's talked about in Exodus 25 through 40. Here's just another image of these basins of water for cleaning and cleansing, but also to symbolize the cosmic ocean, which is around everything. Inside the temple, there would have been luxurious images and carved images. People say that ancient Israelites don't like images, but they loved images. Images of these cherubim would have been all over the walls, palm trees and pomegranates and so on. They weren't supposed to make images of Yahweh. And in fact, when other peoples break into the temple, like the Romans, when they destroy the temple after the time of Jesus, they ran in there and they tried to grab a cult statue. They're like, where's the statue of the god? There's no statue here. Because they liked to take the statues of people who they conquered and display them and parade them around Rome to show off, hey, we did it. But they grabbed one of these menorah, because they're like, that's the closest thing to an image I can find in here. It looks like a tree. It was supposed to be a tree, in fact, the tree of life. So, in any event, but it was an image, right? They had images in Israel, but just not images of Yahweh. That was what you weren't supposed to have. And the priestly source goes along with that. It seems to be across the sources. Here's that Mishkan, the tabernacle. So you can see that this is a lot like the temple. So in the temple, you'd have had this space where priests could go and minister to Yahweh. It would have been like Yahweh's living room. And then there's the bedroom, the Holy of Holies. By the way, if you want to say something is like the best of the best in ancient Israel, you would use this construction, Holy of Holies, or Best of Best, or Song of Songs. That means it's the most songiest of all the songs. The Holy of Holies means it's the most holiest of all holy places. Why is it so holy? Because it's reserved for God alone. It's God's bedroom. Just like you don't want random people wandering around your bedroom, God wants some privacy. And this is God's private special place that only one person can go one day a year. Now notice there's altars in all these spaces. I'll get back to that later. There's an altar here in God's living room. There's an altar here in God's bedroom, or Holy of Holies, right, in the sanctuary. And then out here in the courtyard, there would have been the biggest one for all the people to participate in festivals and feasts. Okay, so this, in miniature, this is like the Mishkan is like the small version of that, the small palace that you take with you when you have to go out and venture out and around. You can see here, this is a small version of the whole thing. Here's the house, and the Holy of Holies would have been here where the Ark was stored. And then you would have had this altar out in the courtyard, but there was a portable altar and the showbread table and the menorah. I'll move my head so you can see the menorah there, right? All these things were, there were portable versions of these for when you had to set out on the move with Yahweh. It's amazing when David takes the ark and parks it in his new city. Well, it's an old city, but he had conquered it and made it into an Israelite city of Jerusalem. That David takes that ark and parades it in. You remember that? When he dances and so on. And he parks that thing, and as far as we know, it never leaves. David takes the mobile presence of God and parks it in his own city and then leaves it there. One might see that these two theologies, a theology of God's presence in a single building, but then also God's mobility, God's ability to move around. That's the Ark of the Covenant. The temple is the theology of God's stability. Those are in tension sometimes, and sometimes people can abuse theologies of either mobility or stability. We'll get to David later on, but just to show you that's the case. Okay, so this is a really important thing here. We're going to talk a little bit about sacrifice. Okay, sacrifice, it's a ritual thing. Sacrifice is hugely important in the ancient world. It's important for us today, I would argue. It can be abused very easily. People are often told to sacrifice all the time when others just don't want to make sacrifices, right? So when a budget cut comes, right, who bears the brunt of it? When there's cuts to be made, who has to tighten their belts, right? Sacrifice can be abused, but I also want to point out that this is a consistent part of human thought and culture and religious ideas ever since the origin of what we would call humanity. Wherever you find groups of very ancient human bones, you will find altars. You will find near those altars human bones. Sorry, not human bones. Well, you'll find people, dead people, but near those things. But you'll find animal bones right near the altars, and you'll find them manipulated in certain ways, cut certain ways, arranged in certain ways, burned as in a fire, right? Used ritually. The cave paintings in Lascaux and so on, these places from 40,000 years ago, you can find human ritual altars there. You can find evidence of the ritual manipulation of human bones from tens of thousands of years ago in Africa. So all to say, this seems to be a consistent part of ancient human practice. Humans were scavengers and hunters, and they ate animals, in the Stone Age. But you can see that there's always this kind of, reverence for the power of life that you can find in the care that's taken with animal bones in the ancient world. So a sacrificial system is a part of, and some theologians have pointed out, this is a part of a larger sacramental mentality. I don't know if you've heard about the sacraments or if you've heard that idea, but a sacrament is a way that God is present tangibly in the world. Where does God actually show up? When does God show up? In ways that are more powerful than others. So sacrifice is the key. It's the key to this ancient sacramental mentality. The gods, if you're outside Israel or if you're in Israel, God shows up in particular at these moments of sacrifice that involve blood. Everyone does this, as I said, throughout the ancient Near East, but also every ancient human culture that we can find manipulates animal blood and bones in this way. So in our readings for today, there's we'll get to this, and we'll talk a little bit about ancient practices of animal manipulation and so on from Hidden Riches. I'll just mention a couple of things that I see in here, but just so you can see, it's not unique to ancient Israel. Blood is extremely important. So Exodus gets to this, by the way, Exodus 20, which we already talked about for the covenant, but I'm just going to return to Exodus chapter 20 for a moment. Exodus 20, verse 24, which says, you need make, and this is, by the way, just right after the Ten Commandments and kind of the beginning of the law, like the first of the laws, right, is this law concerning the altar. And God says, you need only make for me an altar of earth and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your offerings of well-being, your sheep and your oxen, in every place where I cause my name to be remembered. I will come to you and bless you. But if you need to make me an altar of stone, don't build it of hewn, that is like nicely cut stones. Don't make really luxurious stone carvings on the altar. That's what they're trying to say. Use just natural stone. But so the idea is you can make lots of altars according to Exodus chapter 20, verse 24. We'll see that later on, not every biblical text thinks this is the right thing to do. Deuteronomy says there's only one place you can worship, and that's Jerusalem. But according to Exodus, you can have lots of different places to worship, and you can make like the rudest kind of altar that you can imagine, just a heap of earth, and God will come and be there with you there if you want to sacrifice to God. So sacrifice is just this crucial thing that's understood that everyone needs to have access to. Again, later on in Israelite history, it gets centralized. But in this stage, just like Abram and Jacob sacrificed and so on, every small family unit is supposed to sacrifice in some way. So what did sacrifices do? Well, we can think like an anthropologist and say, well, sacrifices, are part of like they just give food to priests, right? It's a way to transfer stuff to nobles, which did occur in the ancient world. For a community, it provides some kind of avenues for, regenerating after a disaster or something. It's kind of a public event that everyone can show up to and so on. Ancient Israelites didn't understand it this way exactly. Ancient Near Easterners said it's food for gods. God needs food. But then there's also this stuff with the blood. So you feed, you have the altar. The altar was a big, giant barbecue. That was the whole point. You barbecued your food there. And you took the blood and then you did some stuff with that. So I'll get to the barbecue part in a little bit. But what I want to talk about right now is the blood. So in the Bible, in Leviticus, we're going to get to this a little bit later, but just to talk about it, and this will be what we focus on next time really, is that you manipulate the blood to make stuff happen. And we'll talk about the exact way that happens next time when we talk about them. But just to say, there's this kind of space in the temple where there are these different altars. The altar in the Holy of Holies, the altar in the sanctuary, and the altar in the courtyard. And they were all understood to kind of align with different levels of offenses or sins. Your brazen and unrepented offenses, the terrible things that people did to each other, murder and things like this, would actually attach to the altar in the Holy of Holies. The involuntary communal sins would attach to the incense altar, which was in the sanctuary. And then the involuntary individual things that you did, bad stuff that you did, that voluntary here has a really interesting meaning. We don't really understand exactly what they mean by it, but if you confess your sin and you try to make it right, then it becomes an involuntary sin. So you can say that maybe it's like unrepented sins are the very brazen, unrepented offenses, and then like communal sins that you recognize and want to confess and want to repair, right? Those are sins that would attach to this altar. Involuntary, or things that you admit and confess to, and individual sins would attach to the altar in the courtyard. And you could take care of stuff there. That is, remember I said the sins of the people, the moral impurities kind of attached to the different altars. It's almost like a magnet, right? Drawing the sin in and kind of holding it, so that you can do something about it. It's kind of like a lightning rod, right? A lightning rod exists on your house and it attracts lightning. Oh no, I got a thing on my house that attracts lightning. No, it attracts the lightning so that it can ground it properly and you can get rid of it and it's not going to hurt you, right? That's what the altar horns are for. They attract sins so that the priests and you, the person who's committed the sin, can take care of it and then get rid of it. If you don't take care of it properly, God's going to get mad. The reason is sin, this moral impurity stuff, is dirty. and God, it's attracted to the altars so that you can get rid of it. But at the same time, it's like trash in God's house. God doesn't like being around moral impurity. So if the moral impurity builds up over time in God's house, eventually God's going to move out, and that threat is constantly there. That people keep saying, the priests keep saying, hey, we need to stop doing this stuff because God might actually get upset with us to the point of leaving. Ezekiel is a prophet and from a priestly family, and Ezekiel says this is why Jerusalem falls, because God got so upset about all the trash, the moral trash that was building up in God's house that wasn't being cared for, that God eventually abandoned the house. In the same way that if somebody moved into your house and started throwing trash everywhere and wouldn't leave, eventually you might leave. So this sacrifice stuff, right? As I said, here's the giant barbecue grill, right? So sacrifice actually is food for priests. Priests actually eat the food. In the ancient Near East, they would have said that the gods eat the food, and it's just food for the gods, etc. In ancient Israel, it played a different role. Ancient Israel said that Yahweh doesn't eat this stuff. Yahweh doesn't eat the food at all. Instead, what Yahweh does is Yahweh smells the nice smell, and Yahweh likes the smell. But what do you do with the food then? Well, the priests eat it. They just tell people in Leviticus, yes, priests eat the food. Like, what, you want priests, right? Priests have to eat. Their families have to eat. It's not like a sleight of hand. Like, where do you think these people are going to get food from? Like, they have to get it from you. So if you want people to help you clean up all of your mess all the time, you have to pay them. And this is the payment, right? That's the sacrifice. But it's not just that. The NRSV translation does a bad job with this, unfortunately, but in Leviticus 5, if translated properly, I think, it becomes very clear that the sin offering or the purification offering, if you do something wrong, you're supposed to invite the person that you've wronged to come to the temple with you, and you're supposed to bring some meat, some food. And then you cook the food on the altar. And then you share the meal with the priest and the people that you've wronged. So do you see what sacrifice is in ancient Israel? It's not a punishment. It's not a tax. It is a reconciliation feast where you pay some reparations to the people that you've wronged. You claim, like that, you put your hand on the animal. You say, I did this. I got it. I have done something here that I need to clean up. And then you share this meal. But that's not just it. So the animal's body that you cook and eat together and share in that meal, that's part of the restoration of people in ancient Israelite society. They didn't have jails in ancient Israel exactly. Today, the American incarceration system is out of control. There's plenty written and said about this, and you'll address this in other classes at CTS more carefully. But just to say, we throw people away in our culture into jails, and we leave them there. This kind of address, ancient Israel couldn't afford to address misdoings like this with this kind of approach. Not to mention the fact that we outlaw a lot of things that we. Anyway, all to say, in ancient Israel, they could not possibly. They're an agrarian society. They can't feed people to sit in jail. So you have to rehabilitate people into society. You have to have reconciliation. It has to be a much more regular practice. So there was a restorative justice element to ancient Israelite approaches to sin or moral impurity. If you really did someone wrong, you'd have to work it out, and you'd have to admit to it, and you'd have to have a giant reconciliation feast that was on your dime, right? You'd have to actually provide the food for it. And the idea was that then you could be rehabilitated into society. And we don't do this today. This might be something we can learn from ancient Israelite priestly theology. So again, it's not about cleaning yourself, getting rid of your own sin. I think in contemporary Christian culture, it's all about kind of like me, right? Like I feel burdened down by sin. I want to get rid of my sin, and so on. In ancient Israel, it was understood to be a communal thing that involved God and involved the priests, but also involved all the people that you had harmed and so on. And it was a communal thing. Like the mess that you make is communal. And they had a way to symbolize that very clearly and materially. And I think we're missing that today. The idea that if you dump a lot of pollutants into a stream, you're offshoring your costs onto everyone else in the neighborhood and poisoning them and so on. But there's no way for us to symbolize materially that this is something that you've done to everyone else and that to God, right? You might say, oh, I'm going to pray to God and say I'm sorry about that, but you haven't cleaned up the mess that you made. Here, the idea is that you have to visually clean up a mess. and you have to visually restore and come back into relationship with certain people. So anyway, I see this as a really interesting and important piece of ancient Israelite theology. We see these four horned altars all over the ancient Near East. This is not new to Israel. They're borrowing this idea from other people around them, just like they're borrowing the temple from other people around them. Everybody in the ancient Near East has temples that look like Israelite temples. Holy of Holies, everyone does that. Everyone's got a God's bedroom. Everyone's making their temples look like a palace for the God. This is, again, a very typical part of ancient Israelite society. So in Leviticus 4, we can see this one ceremony, by the way, which looks a lot like the ceremonies that you'll see in things like hidden riches, right? Now we will talk more about ritual next time. For next module, we'll get into hidden riches, and we'll spend some time with the Hittite rituals and the Babylonian rituals there. So watch out for that. But just for now, let me just preview a little bit and say that we will spend some time thinking about blood and why blood is such an important thing for these rituals. We'll start with that next time. But just to kind of wrap up and to give you a brief overview of this part of the Bible. So Exodus 25 through 31 gives the instructions for building this mobile tent, this mobile sanctuary, right? We want God to be in our presence, but we want it to be safe and appropriate, right? So we want to follow the rules of ritual purity and so on. So God gives the instructions for the building of the altar, and then we get this kind of in-between story. So once God is done giving the instructions for all this making of the altar, then we get the story of Moses coming down and finding that Aaron has led the people astray. It's an interesting story with lots of twists and turns and maybe some unexpected bits. If you look at chapter 32, the people saw that Moses had delayed coming down, and Aaron is there, kind of representing Moses in a way. And the people say, "Come, make gods for us, who shall go up before us." For as this Moses, this guy who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know him, right? So the people want gods. This Yahweh God took them out of Egypt, but has been gone for a long time, and they're getting antsy, right? And then Aaron said, "Hey, take your gold rings and so on and give them to me." So Aaron's going to make the gods, right? Well, then he cast an image of a calf, like a cow, This is interesting because we see this calf imagery come up again. This story is closely connected to 1 Kings 12, the story of Jeroboam and the founding of an altar in the northern kingdom. So, and then they said, so he took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, cast an image of a calf, and they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." So the people say this. It's interesting because there's one calf, and the people are saying they want gods, and then the people say they are gods. But then Aaron saw this, and he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation. He said, "Tomorrow should be a festival to Yahweh." That's the name Yahweh right there. So Aaron makes one calf and calls it Yahweh and says, we're going to have a festival to Yahweh. The people want gods. Notice that the calf is in the bull family, right? The cow family, the bovine family. That's associated with Jacob, right? This is like an image that's not like too far removed from images that are associated with Yahwistic worship of Yahweh. But nonetheless, this is seen as a huge infraction. We're going to get back to the kind of strange disconnect between the two parts of that story right there when we get back to 1 Kings 12. I'm sorry we don't have time to spend too much on it here. But so Moses breaks the tablets, gets very upset and so on. There's this plague that comes around. There's this very violent story of the sons of Levi. We'll get back to Levi and the Levites next time. But then there's also this story of God appearing to Moses but has to shield Moses in the rock in chapter 34, right? The glory of gods. This is a very important image of God's overwhelming glory and how even Moses needed to be protected from God, could only look at God's backside. That's literally the word there, the middle of God's backside. Moses could see the edges of the glory of God's rear. So in any event, I'm not kidding, that's actually the way that the story goes. It's fascinating that it's said that way. But then we get this kind of other 10 commandments there. Again, we don't have a whole lot of time to go over this, but just to point out there are a few really interesting issues here that we can come back to maybe another time when we talk about the 10 Commandments. But then we get back into another part of the story, which is the remaking or the making of all of this stuff after God remakes the covenant with Moses and gives Moses the 10 Commandments again. Here we see a little image of a bull. This is a bull from Samaria. This is clearly involved in the worship of Yahweh. This is not a foreign god, the golden calf. It's Yahweh, and they used calves and bulls in the northern kingdom to worship Yahweh. It was a dispute about what image you should use to associate with Yahweh. The cherubim or the bull. That's one of the main fights that we see between the priests of the north and the priests of the south. Yahweh wasn't the bull. Yahweh was riding on the bull. Here you see images of ancient gods riding on their totem animals. Right, so the bull is the totem animal where Yahweh would be enthroned upon, or the cherubim would be a different totem animal that Yahweh would be enthroned upon, right, or ride on. Yahweh rides on the cherubim and so on. So there's different kind of associations that people would have. It's kind of like a color of the carpet in the sanctuary kind of dispute. What animals associated with Yahweh? Except sometimes, for priests, these things have high stakes. I'm Episcopalian, so I know about priests getting upset about little variations in the liturgy and things like that. But that's a bit what we have here. Now, there's another issue, which is that the people want to worship other gods. But that's actually distinct from what Aaron is up to, according to the narrative. So then in Exodus 35, after the relationship is remade by Moses, right, and God gets real mad and says, I want to throw these people away and start with you, Moses. And Moses says, no, we're not going to do that. Remember, you did that with Noah and it didn't work out. You got this plan to stick with these people, even though they might get on your nerves a bit. And God says, thanks for reminding me, Moses. And then the relationship's remade, and then the people have to make and carry out these instructions. I have here a medieval image of Bezalel right here and Holiab. Those are the divine artisans who are employed by God and chosen by God to make these beautiful things. That is to say, artistic production has often been minimized in especially Protestant Christian heritage. But here we have this divine mandate that the most talented people in the community be given the tools and the skills and the training and the resources to be able to make beautiful art that symbolizes Yahweh's presence with the people. Just want to point out that art matters, music matters, beautiful spaces matter, and it's possible that, and it often happens, that we can put too much stock in these things or worship them or turn them into idols or value them too much and so on. Obviously, people are more important than things, but at the same exact time, people are more important than things, but also people are important, and people's experience of beauty is important and is often linked to our understanding of God. So do people have beautiful things to look at, right? Are there artists in your midst who are energized by God, like Oholiab and Bezalel, to create things for the enjoyment and beauty of others? That's something that God has encouraged us to do, given a sacred task to these folk. So in any event, all to say, that's the rest of this story is the people kind of trying to get their resources together and create the stuff that God has asked them to create to symbolize God's presence and regulate God's presence among them. At the very end of Exodus, Israel is hitting full stride. Everyone is giving so much stuff, so much of their resources, that God has to say, stop, you've given too much. We have more than we need. And the people are working together and building together and preparing for a life together in the land and so on. And at the very end of Exodus, notice how it ends. End of chapter 40, verse 34, the last paragraph. Then, after all this work, right? So Moses finished the work is the last little bit right before then. So they've been working, building up this stuff. And then the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. There's the glory of God. God's presence fills the tabernacle after all this work to prepare for it. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Even Moses couldn't go in, right? Whenever the cloud was taken up and so on, you hear about the cloud again. And Israel started going on the stages of their journey. It's a little vision of life at full tilt, life at full stretch. We run into problems pretty soon, but you got to enjoy those moments when things actually click. And that's this moment here. All right. In the next module, we'll talk a little bit more about blood and sacred blood. Why is it that blood is so important to God? We'll talk about other ancient Near Eastern rituals. We'll talk about priests. Who are they? How did they become priests? What about these priestly families like Zadok and like Melchizedek, like Aaron? And we'll talk a little bit about rituals. What kind of rituals did they have and when and why? And what about these calendars and so on? The wild and wacky and wonderful world of priests continues next.